couldn't make the sessions. And I'm sharing my screen. You should be able to see what looks like an Excel spreadsheet. Can you see that?
Yes, sir, I can.
Perfect. Okay. So first off, just want to welcome everybody to this brown bag virtual lunch slash brunch slash breakfast, depending on your time zone. And thank you for volunteering for this effort. Before we jump into kind of the specifics of really what we're looking for, and to help you kind of organize not only yourself but those in your special interest group, I wanted to just take a step back and talk a little bit about one of the goals of this National Security Agency funded curriculum project, and that is to identify a model that helps us create a sustainable open source development community for curriculum development, or said differently, a crowdsource approach to content development. And part and parcel with this goal is how we can better engage the curriculum standards panel participants that National CyberWatch has spearheaded in the instructional design process. And there are a couple analog models that can guide the curriculum standards panel design, and they're based on reward structures that have successfully supported thriving communities of practice. So one model is the open source development model, right? All of kind of the Linux kernel and various distributions. And that model, the reward itself, or the motivation for participating in the community, is attribution, right? You're attributed with writing some technical documentation, or perhaps you wrote code that got put into the latest version of the Linux kernel, or you found some vulnerability in a piece of code, or you provided a patch. And the motivation and or reward is attribution itself. And so as we think about folks developing content for this competency-based education slash mastery course, information security fundamentals course, and we move forward and continue to build out additional competency-based mastery learning curricula, that's one way in which folks in the community would be rewarded, is through attribution. There is another model, though, that we've looked to as well, and that is the academic publishing model, where the reward is attribution. So, right, typically for journal length contributions, and perhaps even a royalty-based model, where folks write substantial, say, book length work, or a chapter in a book, or they participate and they write multiple chapters. And so we're thinking about both of those models. And if you're interested in continuing to develop content as part of a national repository of competency-based mastery learning objects, and you're specifically interested in kind of either of these models, or you perhaps have some other models you think might work, I'd love to hear from you. So I'm going to, in the chat room, I'm going to post my email address, which is cobrien, COBRIEN, @nationalcyberwatch.org. Are there any comments or questions about that before we get into more of the specifics for today's brown bag?
I have no questions.
Okay. So do the four of you, I see Seagrove, Brenda, Drew, and Kogunlana. Are you for, do you know what special interest group or SIG you've been assigned to?
I do.
Yes.
I'm in the penetration testing group.
Okay. So does anybody not know? Okay, perfect. So that's going to be critical, right? So why? Well, what you're looking at on my screen, if you are using the Zoom either web interface or application, if you're not, basically what I'm showing is through some very involved mapping efforts, some of you may have been involved in those, we came up with what are what we call 7 threshold concepts. And these threshold concepts are foundational to mastery of, say, concepts related to an information security fundamentals course, an IT security class, or a class that perhaps aligns with something like a CompTIA Security Plus certification. All right, and they're threshold concepts because their understanding is fundamental to then being able to go on and perhaps specialize in other disciplines within information security. An analogous example might be that there are perhaps some number of concepts in an algebra class, right? There are lots of concepts that are covered in an algebra class, much like there are lots of concepts covered in an IT security fundamentals course. But perhaps some number of those algebraic concepts are threshold concepts, meaning your understanding of those is critical for you to be able to then go on to a next class in a math sequence, perhaps a pre-calculus class. And there may be some number of critical concepts, what we call threshold concepts, that must be understood before you can go on and be successful in then, say, a calculus class. And so our SIGs, our mapping efforts delineated or highlighted these 7 threshold concepts or learning objectives, and you've been assigned to one of 7 special interest groups. And so for this effort, we're looking for folks to develop original learning objects. So original meaning there is nobody owns the copyright. Now, perhaps you own the copyright, that's fine, but you can't use you can't use PowerPoint slides or a lab exercise or a video or any kind of case study or even a syllabus that was created by somebody who owns the copyright. So no publisher's material, right? Since this effort is being funded by the National Security Agency, effectively a federal agency, all of the materials that are being developed are going to go into an open repository and can be freely used. The intellectual property license that we are going to use is the Creative Commons international version, and it's pretty. The Creative Commons licenses, if you're not familiar, you can Google it. They're really they're pretty simple, right? And there are different variations of a theme, but look into that if you want to get more specifics about what's allowed and not allowed based on that license. But for all intents and purposes, right, we're looking for original content, not copyrighted by anybody. Could be if you own the copyright, that's fine. But then you have to allow basically that content to be made publicly available via the Creative Commons International license. Brenda had a question, says, does that include docs from NIST? So if you want to point to additional resources, that's fine. Like if you want to, Brenda, are you assuming something like maybe a special publication from the 800 series as, say, additional resources that learners can go look at?
Correct. As a backup to what I'm saying, I like to give reinforcement to, I use a lot of the NIST documents, and that's why I was inquiring.
Perfect. No problem there, right? Because those also are in the public domain. You can point to YouTube videos. Those typically are considered part of the public domain. The main thing to look out for is, are you using material that somebody else owns the copyright to? And I'm thinking, publishers, for example. You've got a really cool set of PowerPoint slides that were developed by, McGraw-Hill. Well, we can't use those. Unless we get permission from McGraw-Hill to include those in a public repository. Okay, and Alan Watkins has joined us. Alan's really been one of the driving forces behind this effort, him and Dr. David Toby. And he posted in the chat room a link to the Creative Commons license itself, so you can check that out. And I will be the SIG chair for each of your special interest groups. Should have already reached out to you to figure out things like how often are you going to meet, what's the way in which you're going to meet? Is it going to be via phone bridge or some sort of a video conference solution? Perhaps starting to get those members within a SIG to think about dividing and conquering. That is, so I wasn't sure who said they were part of the penetration testing special interest group, but there are concepts related to that. And so as you think about the kind of learning objects you're going to create. Then second, you want to make sure that you are mapping those to relevant concepts in your special interest group. And I'll give you an example in a minute here. And you want to make sure that, let's say Cola is going to, let's say he's really interested in some of the like exploiting vulnerabilities. So he's going to do some lab exercises that show how to identify a vulnerability in a system and then take advantage of that. And so there's no sense in somebody else in SIG 2 doing the same lab. And so the notion that you will collectively get together as a SIG and kind of figure out the processes by which you'll do your work and what you will actually produce, that should be, those conversations should be taking place. Now for SIG 1, we had to identify a new chair, and so if you haven't heard from Barbara yet, you will be. So don't worry, those assigned to SIG 1, if you're like, well, I haven't heard from her yet, she's our original SIG chair had to step down, and we had to identify a new one. So you will be hearing from her. Okay, so that is effectively the main thing. The main takeaway is to determine, first of all, based on the SIG you've been assigned to, what kinds of learning objects you want to create. And again, it can be really anything. I mean, think about the kinds of materials that you create for your classes already. Are there lecture slides? Are there lecture videos? Are there lab exercises? Do you want to do some kind of a challenge, a capture the flag exercise, where you're testing students' ability to apply knowledge and skills they've already been developing through some other modules you have? Do you want to write a case study? Are you interested in putting together a list of external resources based on a specific concept, say in one of the SIGs? All is fair game. So what I want to do is I want to show you a document that you all have access to in the Google community. And so what I've done is I've tried to put together a prototype of how we will eventually kind of the kinds of information we'll be looking for ultimately to build curricula around a competency-based mastery learning course. And if you want to get a good insight into some of the logic and rationale for what we're doing, and perhaps even a model, I would encourage you all to check out Saul Khan, Khan. You may have heard of the Khan Academy. And he's got a book called The One World Schoolhouse, and it's a great read, and it's really, gives insight into his thinking that led to creating the Khan Academy, which is the largest schoolhouse in the world. And the whole notion of mastery learning is talked about a lot in that book. And so if you're looking to you do a little deeper dive into some of the rationale behind some of the work we're doing, I would encourage you all to check that out. And so what you see on my screen here is just the start of me putting together the elements that are required for building learning objects I'm part of SIG 1. And so SIG 1's main threshold concept or learning objective is understanding the fundamentals of network and application vulnerability scanners, common commercial and open source tools, and how to defend against them. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm going to put together some network and host-based scanning labs. And I'm going to focus on a couple tools. So I'm going to focus on a network scanner, Nmap, and I'm going to focus on a protocol analyzer, And I'm going to show students, the learner, how to accomplish certain goals given certain constraints to carry out specific types of scans, with the goal of determining hosts that are alive on a network, figuring out what TCP and UDP ports are open and available on those hosts, figure out the vendor and version of the software running on those TCP and UDP ports, and then try to do some additional type of reconnaissance or information gathering, perhaps some banner grabbing or any other types of techniques that will allow either an attacker or a system or network administrator to have a snapshot of the kinds of services or applications running on various TCP and UDP ports. And so what the first thing I did then is, as I said, well, okay, I want to do some lab exercises, some hands-on lab exercises, and I want to look through the concepts for my special interest group that relate to that learning objective. And so there are, I think, 81 or something, some number, 80 plus of these concepts that were identified as relevant to this learning objective in our mapping work. And I went through those 81 and I came up with about, let's scroll down here, about, 14 or so that relate to the kinds of lab exercises I want to do. But also this learning object in general, credentialed versus non-credential, vulnerability scanning, disabling, that would be a byproduct of doing different types of scans. There's some discussions around ports, a port scanner. All right, so these concepts should be covered, right? Any of the concepts that relate to the learning objects you're going to create that you get from this list here in your special interest group, then you're going to want to make sure your learning objects cover those concepts in one shape, form, or another. And so from there then, what I did is I started to kind of think through a sequence that would take the learner through these lab exercises. And one thing that's different about competency-based and mastery learning curricula is that you cannot assume that the really anything in terms of the learner's readiness for a concept or their understanding of a concept. So in effect, then what I had to do is start working backwards. I realized, okay, if I'm going to do some scanning labs, then there are going to be specific concepts that I'm going to have to introduce. And so one of those is just the notion of scanning, right? Scanning is a noun. So, scanning is it's a noun and a verb, right? You do scanning, but it also is a concept. And so I created a lecture video, no more than 3 minutes, just describing what scanning is. And all throughout the learner working through content, there are assessments built in. And our team, we've got a research team as part of this project that will help you with the assessments themselves. Really, all I care you focus on is figuring out what content you want to create. Make sure that content maps to some number of concepts in your special interest group. And then what we will do is we'll come back and we'll help you. If you say, so Casey said, there are, these concepts that relate to his labs and his lecture videos and stuff, then our research team will be able to go into a system we've created and look for these words and then come up with, based on some open source test banks, some questions that can be used to assess, for example, did the learner understand the concepts that I was talking about in like scanning, for example. And so these are known as declarative knowledge assessments, and there'll be like 3 questions. And the whole notion is, you want to make sure that in a path, on a mastery path of learning, that the learner has sufficiently demonstrated mastery of both knowledge and skill-based components. Right? You don't want to put somebody into a lab environment, have them do some hands-on lab exercise if they haven't demonstrated mastery of, for example, the concepts related to that lab. All right, and so they needed to be introduced to scanning, and then there'll be some sort 3 questions that, multiple choice, true false kinds of questions that assess their readiness that they've mastered that concept and they're ready to go on to the next concept, which is the first kind of scanning technique that I want them to learn, one of maybe 8 or so. And so, but before I put them in a lab environment where they're actually carrying out a ping sweep, I introduce the concept of ping sweep. So again, another lecture video. And then there's another assessment. And then I want them to start introducing a tool that will allow them to carry out a ping sweep. And so there's a lecture video I recorded that talks about mmap. What is it? How is it used? Why would you use it? And then there's another assessment. And if along the way the student is not getting the concepts down, they're not mastering, then the environment could recommend additional content. So Brenda, maybe go check out this NIST publication, or go watch this video, or go check out review slide 17 again. And so there's a couple questions. Drew says, but you assume that the learner has the prerequisite knowledge of the English language, the power button on the PC, how to type. Our conversations have struggled to understand where exactly our learners are starting from. We can't literally assume. Correct. So there is some assumed prior knowledge. There is, and there is a, I don't know, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of a prerequisite assessment. So there is a document that Alan Watkins, some folks on our research team, myself, put together, and use it as a starting point. You have to be able to create files and folders. You have to be able to do regular expressions. You have to be able. There is some prerequisite knowledge and skills that we've identified. And they have to master those before they even come into this. This course. So it's not like we're taking somebody that has no IT background whatsoever. So there will be a readiness assessment, for lack of a better word, that you can give your students to see, right? Are they even ready to take this class that they're in? For example, if there is prerequisites, Brenda asks, let's see, let me go back. Can't it be assumed they have the knowledge? We don't assume anything. We don't assume any knowledge and skills. Now there are some prerequisite knowledge and skills, and once we have that assessment ready to go, we'll share that with you. And that's one of the call to actions. One of the call to actions beyond looking for content, learning objects related to concepts in the SIGs. We're also looking for folks that are interested in piloting this prerequisite. Here, Alan, thank you, Alan. He's got let me pull up that document. So thank you, Alan. So this is this is a work in progress, and based on some initial mapping work and input from subject matter experts, we're saying that in order for learners to be successful in this information security fundamentals course, they've got to be grounded in some of these knowledge and skills. And so we looked at professional certifications as a starting point, and then once they master some of the threshold concepts, for example, in this information security fundamentals, we're saying that they should be able to sit for these certifications, and that, for example, they could then start looking into vertical specializations within the discipline. Perhaps they start moving into advanced network security or intrusion detections, prevention systems, or digital forensics. All right, so here are some of the course readiness domains and topics, right? In effect, right, these will be a measure of how ready the student is to start doing the information security fundamentals course. So, modular arithmetic, being able to, convert between hex and binary, binary and decimal, octal, right, regular expressions. So, and we've detailed these as much as we could, and we've pointed to additional external resources where appropriate. So you've got some scripting stuff, some networking stuff, some computer architecture stuff, some Linux, some basic kind of Linux command line stuff, some simple bash scripts. So you know what a shell is, you know what bash is. You can write a simple shell script. You can put the appropriate permissions on it. You can execute it. Some Windows sysadmin stuff. All right. So hopefully, Drew and Brenda, that helps give you a sense of some of the prerequisite or readiness knowledge and skills that are required before you even then get into the information security fundamentals course. Yep, that's right, Drew. We talked about A+ and Net+ as foundations, and you'll see that we consider those kind of incoming pathways, right? Those are covered. Network+, A+. There's some Server+ stuff in there. Some of the networking stuff, right? So we looked at some additional resources, system administration, what we consider kind of cybersecurity foundations, right? Drew says, although I'm pretty sure my regular expression could use some brushing up, as I'm sure, all of us probably could brush up on some of this stuff. And that's the point, right? You want the learner to be ready so that when they come into the information security fundamentals course, at least they're not, they know some of these foundational knowledge and skills. And it may be, as you introduce a topic, it may be that you have to, brush up on it again. Maybe you talk about, so for example, like I talk about, in one of these, let's see which, so in the ping sweep lecture video, I talk about internet control message protocol, and what, and do kind of a deep dive in ICMP. And then that leads into this whole discussion about the value of running a protocol analyzer while you're running your various tools. And the reason I say that's important is because you get a sense actually of how the tool works. And when you actually when you do the kind of scan eventually that I want students to do, the ping sweep, if you're on a local area network doing a scan of systems on that same data link, actually ICMP traffic isn't used at all. MMAP uses a different technique. And you would not know that unless you were running a protocol analyzer looking at the traffic that the tool, in this case MMAP, is using. And then that automatically now means I introduced other concepts. So ICMP, so now you're talking about protocols, you're talking about a protocol analyzer, and a port scanner, and so all of these concepts now get introduced, and so that's an opportunity then to redirect students to additional resources and make sure that in the knowledge assessment that they take after they watch the lecture video, that they understand those concepts, right? And then I realized, okay, well, I'm going to have to build in a whole bunch of Wireshark labs, because I introduced this concept, and they need to understand the functionality and fundamentals of Wireshark. So there'll be a number of labs there. So I hope you can get a sense of in effect, kind of how I started to lay out the pieces of these labs. And even though I see this implies kind of a sequential ordering, you do 1, then you do 2, then you do 3, then you do 4. In reality, this assessment here this readiness assessment that all learners take before they even jump into any of the content that we're creating as part of this project. It may be that they have to do some brush up here, and then let's say that they've mastered these concepts, which we consider critical for success in information security fundamentals course. All right, well then they're going to do a different assessment. They're going to do an assessment before, so kind of a pre-assessment based on the concepts that I've identified for my learning objects, to make sure that they're from that then an individualized competency profile, or think of it kind of as an individual course gets created, right? And if I know what credentialed versus non-credentialed vulnerability scanning is, or I'm really versed in all the vulnerability scanning stuff, then I don't have to do any of that, right? I've demonstrated mastery of those concepts, and perhaps I put you in an environment where I want to test your ability to carry out a non-credentialed vulnerability scan using a tool against 4 hosts. So be it. Then maybe though you have to brush up on your port scanner stuff. And so the point of competency-based mastery learning is that assessments drive everything, and that there are readiness assessments before a learner tackles a concept or a skill, and there is then a post assessment to make sure they've mastered that concept or that skill, and that they only get the content they need, nothing more, nothing less. So often we may have to reintroduce topics as reminders. If the materials are available, that will help out when that happens. People forget things, or at least I do. Absolutely. And so that's exactly my point when I was talking about doing a ping sweep. Folks probably need a refresher on, they may think ping, oh yeah, I might know what ping is, but we can't assume that. So we got to make sure that that's a concept. And so we got to make sure there are resources available for the learner if they don't know what ping is. But ping is just a utility that relies on a protocol that can be used to test connectivity between 2 systems. And so perhaps we need to remind them about ICMP and. Alan said the intent, excuse me, is that all modules will be available and learners can go back as they need. We still need to build into the platform the sequential completion of certain modules before they can move forward. And that's right. And what Alan means about the platform is we've just for this pilot implementation, we've settled on Moodle Rooms, which is Blackboard's hosted implementation of Moodle. So if you're familiar with Moodle, it's an open source learning management system. Perhaps even your institution uses Moodle. Moodle Rooms is simply Blackboard's hosted version of Moodle. And we've started to, let me click my course here, we've started to set up the elements that will allow the learner to get a customized, if you will, individual competency profile of those learning objects and concepts that they need based on their readiness assessments. And so I've started to build this out. So I've started to include the various elements of the material I'm going to create, and they include both lecture videos and hands-on labs, and we'll have an interface into an external assessment engine. And right now I'm just dumping all of the content into this course shell in a somewhat sequential order, assuming that the learner knows nothing about any of these concepts. Now they mastered whatever the prerequisite knowledge and skills are, and then eventually we'll be able to, based on assessments in, say, for example, this LMS, then customize the learning path for the learner. Can Moodle Rooms link directly into a Blackboard course? Can Moodle Rooms link? So we could give you we could export a course shell that you could import into Blackboard. So Moodle Rooms is basically, it is like Blackboard, except for it's an open source hosted version. So Alan said SIG chairs should have access to the Moodle Room sandbox. This is what I'm showing on my screen right now. If not, let Alan or myself know. We do have, although I can't show it now, I am going to be using CyberWatch developed a partnered private cloud-based solution with virtual machines and hands-on step-by-step and challenge-based lab exercises. It's been available for a couple of years, and we're using learning tools integration, or LTI. So we've got some middleware that allows us to provide a single sign-on. That is, the learner would sign into an LMS. If the LMS supports LTI, then the learner can access hands-on lab exercises by clicking links within the LMS. And then, I don't have it set up yet. I just have a placeholder. But in effect, what happens is it allows the learner then to launch an external platform where they can do the hands-on lab exercises. So once they've sufficiently demonstrated mastery of whatever the concepts are, and they've taken the appropriate knowledge-based assessments, and they're ready to be put into a hands-on environment to actually do something, we can provide that connectivity from our LMS. When you're thinking about creating your content, don't worry about if you want to use VMs, virtual machines, local on your system, or you've got some other sort of a platform or whatever. That's fine. You don't have to use this environment. We're just going to use this environment to show a pilot implementation. All right, Alan said there are NSA templates that each SIG should be using to create PowerPoints for other types of documents. Yeah, the NSA has strict guidelines around accessibility, and they have some stringent requirements for that. And so we've made templates available. So Alan's got a link to those in the chat room. So that's really the main things I wanted to show. There are some call to actions. So one is, we'll be looking for folks that want to pilot some of the prerequisite or readiness assessments, something like this. And we'd be looking for that probably in the late March, April-ish timeframe. If you're teaching a IT security course, or a Security Plus, or a first IT security type class this spring, we would love for you to pilot some of these assessments. And perhaps you give your students extra credit. So that's one of the call to actions. We're looking for folks that are interested in piloting some of the prerequisite readiness assessments. The second call to action is we're looking for folks that want to pilot some of the modules that are actually getting developed. Right, so perhaps you want to, as extra credit, you want to pilot these scanning labs and related learning objects, and both readiness knowledge and also procedural kind of hands-on assessments, and also the post assessments. And what that probably would look like is you would identify some students and yourself. We'd give you access as learners to this sandbox, this Moodle Room sandbox, and then the learners would do the initial prerequisite readiness assessments, and then based on that they would get, you know, a customized version of these labs based on the scanning stuff, and then they would work through and do the assessments and help us kind of work out any kinks. And again, you would, you know, you give your students extra credit or something. The third call to action is the learning objects themselves. So start thinking about the kinds of learning objects you want to create, how they map to the concepts in your specific special interest group, and then start cranking away on creating that content. And your SIG chairs can be your first point of contact, but if you have any questions, I'm here to help. Alan is more than willing to answer any questions anytime. And then the last call to action is just how I started the whole entire brown bag, which is this notion of us wanting to create a sustainable open source development community for curriculum development, and the notion of motivizing and incentivizing contributors in the way in which they want to they respond to, you know, different motivators and incentives. And so perhaps that's, you know, attribution, and we recognize your work in an annual conference or in the National CyberWatch Center marketing and communication efforts, and or perhaps it's of the royalty variety, you know, where we pay you a royalty on every use of your lecture video or your lab exercise. So if you're interested in perhaps continuing to be a contributor of content as part of this open source development community, and then I'd love you to reach out to me. And also, if there are other models we may consider beyond, say, just like the open source development model where your reward is attribution, or the academic publishing model where, you know, you get a royalty for a substantial, say, book length work. If there are other models that you think may work as we try to build this, you know, this thriving community of practice, I'd love to hear those ideas. So that's the official program, unless anybody else has any questions. All right, hearing none, I hope everybody has a great rest of their Friday and weekend, and we're here to answer any questions. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your efforts in this important work, and we'll be in touch soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.